So I'm gonna do a little quick stream here. Don't want to stream too long, but let's get it. I'm gonna read our book. Reading books. Shit. You know what it is. Propaganda of agitation and propaganda of integration. The second great distinction within the general phenomenon of propaganda is the distinction between propaganda of agitation and propaganda of integration. Here we find such a summa divisio that we may ask ourselves if the methods, themes, characteristics, publics, and objectives are so different, are we not really dealing with two separate entities rather than two aspects of the same phenomenon? This distinction corresponds in part to the well-known distinction of Lenin between agitation and propaganda, but here the meaning of these terms is reversed. It is also somewhat similar to the distinction between propaganda of subversion and propaganda of collaboration. Propaganda of agitation, being the most visible and widespread, generally attracts all the attention. It is the most often subversive propaganda and has the stamp of opposition. It is led by a party seeking to destroy the government or the established order. It seeks rebellion or war. It has always had a place in the course of history. All revolutionary movements, all popular wars have been nourished by such propaganda of agitation. Spartacus relied on this kind of propaganda, as did the Communes, the Crusades, the French movement of 1793, and so on. But it reached its height with Lenin, which leads us to note that, though it is most often an opposition's propaganda, the propaganda of agitation can also be made by government. For example, when a government wants to galvanize energies to mobilize the entire nation for war, it will use propaganda of agitation. At that moment, the subversion is aimed at the enemy, whose strength must be destroyed by psychological as well as physical means, and whose force must be overcome by the vigor of one's own nation. Governments also employ this propaganda of agitation when, after having been instilled in power, they want to pursue a revolutionary course of action. Thus, Lenin, having installed the Soviets, organized the agitprops and developed the long campaign of agitation in Russia to conquer resistance and crush the kulaks. In such a case, subversion aims at the resistance of a segment or a class, and an internal enemy is chosen for attack. Similarly, most of Hitler's propaganda was propaganda of agitation. Hitler could work his sweeping social and economic transformations only by constant agitation, by overexcitement, by straining energies to the utmost. Nazism grew by successive waves of feverish enthusiasm and thus attained its revolutionary objectives. Finally, the great campaigns in communist China were precisely propaganda of agitation. Only such propaganda could produce those great leaps forward. The system of communes was accepted only because of propaganda of agitation, which unleashed simultaneously physical action by the population and a change in their behavior, by subverting habits, customs, and beliefs that were obstacles to the great leap forward. This was internal propaganda, and Mao was perfectly right in saying that the enemy is found within each person. Propaganda of agitation addresses itself, then, to internal elements in each of us, but it is always translated into reality by physical involvement in a tense, overexcited activity. By making the individual participate in this activity, the propagandist releases the internal brakes, the psychological barriers of habit, belief, and judgment. The Piatelikta campaign in the Soviet Union must also be classified as propaganda of agitation. Like the Chinese campaign, its aim was to stretch energies to the maximum in order to obtain the highest possible work output. Thus, for a while, propaganda of agitation can serve productivity, and the principal examples of propaganda of agitation conducted by governments are of that type. But agitation propaganda most often is revolutionary propaganda in the ordinary sense of the term. Thus, communist propaganda in the West, which provokes strikes or riots, is of this type. The propaganda of Fidel Castro, that of Ho Chi Minh before he seized power, and that of the FLN are the most typical recent examples. So propaganda of agitation sparks riots. That means Black Lives Matter is propaganda of agitation, and the propaganda about the elections being stolen and getting people to riot at the Capitol Hill building, also propaganda of agitation on the right. I guess we're seeing more on the left as the left seeks to overthrow the current order, while the right pretends to support the current order, but really the right doesn't support the current order because the right and the left are fucking aligned. In all cases, propaganda of agitation tries to stretch energies to the utmost, obtain substantial sacrifices, and induce the individual to bear heavy ordeals. It takes him out of his everyday life, his normal framework, and plunges him into enthusiasm and adventure. It opens him hitherto unsuspected possibilities and suggests extraordinary goals that nevertheless seem to him completely within reach. Propaganda of agitation thus unleashes an explosive movement. It operates inside a crisis or actually provokes the crisis itself. On the other hand, such propaganda can obtain only effects of relatively short duration. If the proposed objective is not achieved fast enough, enthusiasm will give way to discouragement and despair. Therefore, specialists in agitation propaganda break up the desired goals into a series of stages to be reached one by one. There is a period of pressure to obtain some result, then a period of relaxation and rest. This is how Hitler, Lenin, and Mao operated. A people or a party cannot be kept too long at the highest level of sacrifice, conviction, and devotion. The individual cannot be made to live in a state of perpetual enthusiasm and insecurity. After a certain amount of combat, he needs a respite and a familiar universe to which he is accustomed. This subversive propaganda of agitation is obviously the flashiest. It attracts attention because of its explosive and revolutionary character. It is also the easiest to make. In order to succeed, it need only be addressed to the most simple and violent sentiments through the most elementary means. Hate is generally its most profitable resource. It is extremely easy to launch a revolutionary movement based on hatred of a particular enemy. Hatred is probably the most spontaneous and common sentiment. It consists of attributing one's misfortunes and sins to another who must be killed in order to assure the disappearance of those misfortunes and sins. Whether the object of hatred is the bourgeoisie, the communist, the Jew, the colonialist, or the saboteur makes no difference. Propaganda of agitation succeeds each time it designates someone as a source of all misery, provided that he is not too powerful. Yeah, I've been saying this for a while, guys, that we are being indoctrinated to hate. Okay? It's very clear. So we must resist the temptation to hate your brother, and you must love your enemies. You cannot have sustainable relationships based on hate. I see this on the internet all the time. These groups form around a common hate. Okay? And it's not sustainable because your relationship is now based on you both hate the same thing and get along. Eventually, because hate is destructive, you will hate each other every time. You cannot sustain a relationship, friendship, based on your mutual hatred. You will grow to hate each other every time I see it. Of course, one cannot draw basic conclusions from a movement launched in this way. It is extraordinary to see intellectuals, for example, take anti-white sentiments of Algerians and Negroes seriously and believe that these express fundamental feelings. Wow! Wow! Listen to that! It is extraordinary to see intellectuals, for example, take anti-white sentiments of Algerians or Negroes seriously and believe that these express fundamental feelings. To label the white man, who is the invader and the exploiter, it is true, as the source of all ills and to provoke revolts against him is an extremely easy job, but it proves neither that the white man is the source of all evil nor that the Negro automatically hates him. However, hatred once provoked continues to reproduce itself. Wow. They had that bullshit back then too, huh? So it's easy to label the white man evil, but it proves neither that the white man is the source of all evil. No. So you can label white people evil, but it doesn't prove that they're evil. And it doesn't make that black people hate white people. However, hatred once provoked continues to reproduce itself and grow. Along with this universal sentiment found in all propaganda of agitation, even when provoked by the government, and even in the movement of the Chinese communes. Along with this universal sentiment found in all propaganda of agitation, are secondary motives more or less adapted to the circumstances. A sure expedient is the call to liberty among an oppressed, conquered, invaded, or colonized people. Calls summoning the Cuban or Algerian people to liberty, for example, are assured of sympathy and support. The same is true for the promise of bread to the hungry, the promise of land to the plundered, and the call to truth among the religious. As a whole, these are appeals to simple, elementary sentiments requiring no refinement, and thanks to which the propagandists can gain acceptance for the biggest lies, the worst delusions, sentiments that act immediately, provoke violent reactions, and awaken such passions that they justify all sacrifices. Such sentiments correspond to the primary needs of all men: the need to eat, to be one's own master, to hate. Given the ease of releasing such sentiments, the material and psychological means employed can be simple: the pamphlet, the speech, the poster, the rumor. In order to make propaganda of agitation, it is not necessary to have the mass media of communication at one's disposal, for such propaganda feeds on itself, and each person seized by it becomes in turn a propagandist. Just because it does not need a large technical apparatus, it is extremely useful as a subversive propaganda. Nor is it necessary to be concerned with probability or veracity. Any statement whatever, no matter how stupid, any tall tale, will be believed once it enters into the passionate current of hatred. A characteristic example occurred in July 1960 when Patrice Lumumba claimed that the Belgians had provoked the revolt of the Congolese soldiers in the camp at Thiesville. Finally, the less educated and informed the people to whom propaganda of agitation is addressed, the easier it is to make such propaganda. That is why it is particularly suited for use among the so-called lower class, the proletariat, and among African peoples. There it can rely on some key words of magical import, which are believed without question, even though the hearers cannot attribute any real content to them and do not fully understand them. Among colonized peoples, one of these words is independence, an extremely profitable word from the point of view of effective subversion. It is useless to try to explain to people that national independence is not at all the same as individual liberty, that the black peoples generally have not developed to the point at which they can live in political independence in the Western manner, that the economy of their countries permits them merely to change masters. But no reason can prevail against the magic of the word, and it is the least intelligent people who are most likely to be thrown into a revolutionary movement by such summary appeals. That's pretty interesting. In contrast to this propaganda of agitation is the propaganda of integration, the propaganda of developed nations and characteristics of our civilization. In fact, it did not exist before the 20th century. It is the propaganda of conformity. It is related to the fact, analyzed earlier, that in Western society it is no longer sufficient to obtain a transitory political act. One needs total adherence to a society's truths and behavioral patterns. As the more perfectly uniform the society, the stronger its power and effectiveness. Each member should be only an organic and functional fragment of it, perfectly adapted and integrated. He must share the stereotypes, beliefs, and reactions of the group. He must be an active participant in its economic, ethical, aesthetic, and political doings. All his activities, all his sentiments are dependent on this collectivity. And, as he is often reminded, he can fulfill only through this collectivity as a member of the group. Propaganda of integration thus aims at making the individual participate in his society in every way. It is a long-term propaganda, self-reproducing propaganda that seeks to obtain stable behavior, to adapt the individual to his everyday life, to reshape his thoughts and behavior in terms of the permanent social setting. We can see that this propaganda is more extensive and complex than propaganda of agitation. It must be permanent, for the individual can no longer be left to himself. In many cases, such propaganda is confined to rationalizing an existing situation, to transforming unconscious actions of members of a society into concisely desired activity that is visible, laudable, and justified. Perlin and Rosenberg call this the elaboration of latent consequences. In such cases, it must be proved that the listeners, the citizens in general, are the beneficiaries of resultant socio-political developments. Integration propaganda aims at stabilizing the social body, at unifying and reinforcing it. It is thus the preferred instrument of government, though properly speaking, it is not exclusively political propaganda. Since 1930, the propaganda of the Soviet Union, as well as that, since the war, of all the people's republics, has been a propaganda of integration. But this type of propaganda can also be made by a group of organizations other than those of government, going in the same direction, more or less, spontaneously, more or less, planned by the state. The most important example of the use of such propaganda is the United States. Obviously, integration propaganda is much more subtle and complex than agitation propaganda. It seeks not a temporary excitement, but a total molding of the person in depth. Here, all psychological and opinion analysis must be utilized, as well as the mass media of communication. It is primarily this integration propaganda that we shall discuss in our study, for it is the most important of our time, despite the success and the spectacular character of subversive propaganda. At the conference on ideological problems held in Moscow at the end of December 1961, the need to shape the communist man was reaffirmed, and propagandists were blamed for the 20-year delay in achieving this goal. Let us note right away a final aspect of integration propaganda. The more comfortable, cultivated, and informed the milieu to which it is addressed, milieu means like social current or whatever, or like, actually, why don't I just... social environment. I was close. Okay, let us note right away a final aspect of integration propaganda. The more comfortable, cultivated, and informed the milieu to which it is addressed, the better it works. Intellectuals are more sensitive than peasants to integration propaganda. In fact, they share the stereotypes of a society even when they are political opponents of the society. Take a recent example. French intellectuals opposed to war in Algeria seemed hostile to integration propaganda. Nevertheless, they shared all the stereotypes and myths of French society, technology, nation, progress. All their actions were based on those myths. They were thoroughly ripe for an integration propaganda, for they were already adapted to its demands. Their temporary opposition was not of the slightest importance. Just changing the color of the flag was enough to find them again among the most conformist groups. I have to go to the bathroom. I'll be right back. Eins, Wein, drei. have a tiny bladder. One essential problem remains. When a revolutionary movement is launched, it operates, as we have said, with agitation propaganda. But once the Revolutionary Party has taken power, it must begin immediately to operate with integration propaganda, save for the exceptions mentioned. That is the way to balance its power and stabilize the situation. But the transition from one type of propaganda to the other is extremely delicate and difficult. After one has, over the years, excited the masses, flung them into adventures, fed their hopes and their hatreds, opened the gates of action to them, and assured them that all their actions were justified, it is difficult to make them re-enter the ranks, to integrate them into the normal framework of politics and economics. So a lot of times they have them killed. Shh, that's the secret. So they agitate you, and they use you to take power, and then they genocide you. It's true. It's true. Alright, now I lost my place. Ran to the ranks. I like how he says that he tells them they were justified. How many times have you heard our leaders be like, I understand why Black Lives Matter is rioting. I understand why they are doing these things. They're telling them they're justified to do evil. This is agitation. Black Lives Matter is agitation propaganda. Soon as they take power, guess who's getting genocided? Oh yeah, all you revolutionaries. You think it's fucking cool now? Well, guess what happens when you get your way? You're going to a work camp and you're gonna die. Idiot. So it's difficult to integrate them back into the normal framework of politics, and that once you radicalize these fucking idiots, it's difficult to integrate them back. So we genocide them. What has been unleashed cannot be brought under control so easily, particularly habits of violence or of taking the law into one's own hands. These disappear very slowly. This is all the more true because the results achieved by revolution are usually deceptive. Just to seize power is not enough. The people want to give full vent to the hatred developed by agitation propaganda, and to have the promised bread or land immediately. And the troops that helped in the seizure of power rapidly become the opposition and continue to act as they did under the influence of subversion propaganda. The newly established government must then use propaganda to eliminate these difficulties and to prevent the continuation of the battle. See? He's saying what I just said. That's history. They use you for revolution. Once they gain power, they eliminate your dumb ass. They don't give a fuck about you. When the Bolsheviks in Russia made all these promises to homosexual fags that, oh, we'll give you gay rights. Oh, we love homosexuals. And the homosexuals were like, cool, let's support them and we can have rights when they get in power. As soon as they got in power, they outlawed homosexuality and they put all the gays in work camps. Damn, too bad. But this must be propaganda designed to incorporate individuals into the new order, to transform their opponents into collaborators of the state, to make them accept delays in fulfillment of promises. In other words, it must be integration propaganda. Generally, only one element, hatred, can be immediately satisfied. Everything else must be changed. Obviously, this conversion of propaganda is very difficult. The techniques and methods of agitation propaganda cannot be used. The same feelings cannot be aroused. Other propagandists must be employed, as totally different qualities are required for integration propaganda. The greatest difficulty is that agitation propaganda produces very rapid and spectacular effects, whereas integration propaganda acts slowly, gradually, and imperceptibly. After the masses have been subjected to agitation propaganda to neutralize their aroused impulses with integration propaganda, without being swept away by the masses, is a delicate problem. In some cases, it is actually impossible to regain control of the masses. The Belgian Congo is a good example. The black people, very excited since 1959 by Lumumba's propaganda, first released their excitement by battling among themselves. Then, once the black government was installed, they ran wild and it was impossible to get them under control. That was the direct effect of Lumumba's unrestrained propaganda against the Belgians. It seems that only a dictatorship can help this situation. Another good example is given by Sauvé. During the war, broadcasts from London and Algiers aroused the French people on the subject of food shortages and accused Germans of artificially creating scarcity through requisitioning. After liberation, the government was unable to overcome the effects of this propaganda. Abundance was expected to return immediately. It was impossible to control inflation and maintain rationing. Integration failed because of prior agitation. In some cases, agitation propaganda leads to a partial failure. Sometimes there is a very long period of trouble and unhappiness during which it is impossible to restore order, and only after a dozen years of integration propaganda can the situation be controlled again. Obviously, the best example is the Soviet Union. As early as 1920, integration propaganda, as conceived by Lenin, was employed, but it dampened the revolutionary mentality only very slowly. Only after 1929 did the effects of agitation propaganda finally disappear. The Kronstadt Rebellion was a striking example. In other cases, the government must follow the crowds, which cannot be held back once they are set off. The government is forced, step by step, to satisfy appetites aroused by agitation propaganda. This was partly the case with Hitler. After taking power, he continued to control the people by agitation propaganda. He thus had to hold out something new all the time on the road to war: rearmament, the Rhineland, Spain, Austria, Czechoslovakia. The propaganda aimed at the SA and SS was agitation propaganda, as was the propaganda pushing the German people into war in 1937 through 1939. At the same time, the population as a whole was subjected to a propaganda of assimilation. Thus, Hitler used two kinds of propaganda simultaneously. Similarly, in the Soviet Union, agitation propaganda against imperialists and saboteurs, or for the fulfillment of the plan, is employed simultaneously with propaganda of integration into the system through political education, youth movements, and so on. This is exactly the situation today of Castro in Cuba. He is incapable of integrating and can only pursue his agitation propaganda. This will lead him inevitably to dictatorship and probably to war. Power to the people. Other regimes, however, have managed perfectly well to pass from one propaganda to the other, and to make integration propaganda take the lead rapidly. Thus was the case in North Vietnam and China, and was owing to the remarkable conception of propaganda, which they have had since the time of revolution. In fact, since 1927, Mao's propaganda has been subversive. It appeals to the most basic feelings in order to arouse revolt. It leads to combat, it conditions people, and it relies on slogans. But at the same time, as soon as the individual is pressed into the army, he is subjected to an integration propaganda that Mao calls political education. Long-winded explanations tell him why it is necessary to act in a particular way. A biased but seemingly objective news system is set up as part of that propaganda. Behavior is regimented and disciplined. The integration of the revolutionary rebel into a prodigiously discipled, organized, and regimented army, which goes hand in hand with his intellectual and moral indoctrination, prepares him to be taken into custody by integration propaganda after victory, and to be asserted into the new society without resistance or anarchical excursions. This patient and meticulous shaping of the whole man, this putting into the mold, as Mao calls it, is certainly his principal success. Of course, he began with a situation in which man was already well integrated into the group, and he substituted one complete framework for another. Also, he needed only to shape the minds of people who had very little education, in the Western sense of the term, and so that they learned to understand everything through images, stereotypes, slogans, and interpretations that he knew how to inculcate. Under such conditions, integration is easy and practically irreversible. Lastly, the distinction between the two types of propaganda partly explains the defeat of French propaganda in Algeria since 1955. On one side, the propaganda of the FLN was an act of agitation designed to arouse feelings of subversion and combat. Against this, French army pitted a propaganda of integration, of assimilation into a French framework and into a French administration. French political concepts, education, and professional training and ideology. But a world of difference lay between the two as the speed, ease, and effectiveness, which explains why in this competition between propagandas, the FLN won out at almost every stage. This does not mean that FLN propaganda reflected the real feeling of the Algerians, but if some say, "You are unhappy, so rise and slay your master, and tomorrow you will be free," and others say, "We will help you, work with you, and in the end, all your problems will be solved," there is little question as to who will command allegiance. In spite of everything, however, integration propaganda, as we have said above, is by far the most important new fact of our day. And there is a good spot to end. Damn, that was a long section there. Well, that's cool. We read book. We smart. We interesting. Shit. No one watched my stream. Yeah.